Further concerns. Soon after William Pollock had commenced his work in Baguio, he soon realised that there was a great deal of work to be done in terms of education among those he met professing Christianity. Remember, he had learned and studied the gospel during his 14 years of imprisonment inside New Billerby Prison and not in a Christian church in the busy Free Society, and for that reason he established a theological institute in Baguio City teaching monergistic theology, or as we say in the UK, the doctrines of sovereign grace, an institute similar to what they had in New Billerby Prison. It was in this institute that they adopted Louis Berkhof's systematic theology as a basic textbook for their students. I was greatly encouraged by this move, since William had realised that Arminianism, which was the root of many of these errors in the Christian religion, needed to be addressed by teaching the biblical and reformed view of salvation. This had been my experience in my early years and present Christian life. I had recently experienced persecution from a church in Warsash in Hampshire in England by elders of a church who wished to appoint women as elders in the church, which was directly contradictory to the Bible, and for this reason I asked Lucas Dangatton, the head pastor in New Billerby Prison Theological Institute, to launch an assignment, asking some of his students and qualified men who were inmate pastors to write an assignment on the roles of women in the church. As I had noticed in the prisons, ladies were functioning and called pastoras, which is a female name for pastor. This assignment may be read in our book Trojan Warriors and Mary, Mary Quite Contrary. Sadly, to my disappointment, Lucas didn't wish for them to do so, since they relied upon many women coming into the prison who supplied much money and needed goods, and he didn't wish to upset the women. It was my view they would have been ideally suited to write such an assignment, as they were free from the outside world and would be directed by the Bible alone and not influenced by the false views of churches that they would meet on the outside world on their release. Not only so, Lucas asked my brother not to make too much of the sovereignty of God, because many of the men held Arminian views, the very root error held by the elders of the Warsash Church and other churches that I had attended. Also, I had met with strange behaviour in the meetings of other churches in Hampshire, where people were falling over on the floor, running and the like, and making noises like dog barking, coupled with the use of rain sticks to create an atmosphere of spirituality. These groups maintained they were speaking in tongues and worshipping God. At one such meeting, I met a visitor from Toronto, from the Vine Airport Church, who promoted this activity and called it the Toronto Blessing. I also witnessed groups allegedly speaking in tongues all at once, just like the practice of Kundalini in the Buddhist religion. It was wrong. Another religious practice that developed was people who practiced grave hugging by those who wanted to get spiritual power from the deceased person, such as C.S. Lewis, Smith Wigglesworth, none of which is scriptural and on a par with spiritualism and the use of crosses, candles and other religious relics to promote spirituality. At another such meeting in England, a meeting of the Christian Businessmen's Fellowship, they were being convinced that the presence of God was there by the glittering particles of gold resting on people's heads and shoulders and clothing. I think they called it glory dust, but this practice was unknown and not sanctioned by evidence from Scripture. It left an open door for false teaching to be spread. It was all wrong and not according to the Bible, and not to be engaged in or encouraged. On our second mission visit to the prison in 2002, which William Pollock may have heard of, was another disturbing event that took place where a visiting guest whom we had invited to speak to several inmates, including gang commanders, in the officer in charge's room with guards present. At that meeting with Gordon Smith, Alistair and I, we witnessed this visiting speaker address these inmates by saying he wanted them to speak in tongues. He asked them to repeat exactly what he was going to say. There were about 20 inmates, none of which we knew were Christians. 2 were gang commanders, and it was a privileged opportunity to preach the gospel to them. However, this visitor took over the meeting, and he then began to speak just like those who say they're speaking in tongues, making unintelligible speech, and that repeatedly, and he got them all to copy him. He did this repetitively several times. As they did, he did it several times, and they all copied him. In his journal, which he published to the group, this visiting guest wrote that it was like a mini Pentecost and all the inmates got saved, including the guards. It was just nonsense and a deception and should never be repeated. On another occasion, I witnessed so-called prophecy being predicted by certain things by means of a warning, like unless certain things are done, necessary money would be withheld. Again, it was not Christian religion, but the opposition. I was therefore encouraged that William had seen the need to address these many issues being taught and received by Christians in his day. It would seem William witnessed similar things, and for that reason I wrote and encouraged him to write a field manual, sharing the problems that he had identified and the needs and the things to teach to new converts. I was greatly encouraged by William and their adoption of Louis Berkhof's systematic theology and their theological institute, and so it was in 2019 that I began working on a republished edition of Dr. John Gill's body of doctrinal and practical divinity, and publishing it as a special edition, dedicating it to students, teachers and pastors of Christ-centered churches in the Philippines. I made this available as a 5-volume set and as PDF downloads or hard-printed copies. This news I relate in the YouTube video, Truth Had Fallen in the Street, a work that I believe we should adopt in our gospel outreach work in the UK and Pakistan.